whatever might be happening, I think there are signs of Africa's rebirth.
There is no question that Africa has played a vital role in the evolution of humanity. From the making of tools and weapons out of stone, to man's revolutionary changeover from a food-hunting nomad to a farmer who raised grains and domesticated animals. Africans made substantial contributions with the use of metal, the creation of civilizations, the mastery of the ocean, and to all of mankind's other accomplishments. It has been said that Egypt was the cradle of Western civilization. In his book Egypt, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge says, "The prehistoric native of Egypt, both in the Old and the New Stone Ages, was an African, and there is every reason for saying that the earliest settlers came from the south." What the Egyptian civilization contributed to the evolution of mankind in the areas of medicine, astrology, mathematics, physics, and the arts has never been in question. The persistent question, however, has always been, who were the native Egyptians? Besides Egypt, there have been other areas in Africa that produced some remarkable civilizations. In the not-so-distant past, several African kingdoms rose in West Africa between the 11th and the 16th centuries. The most notable of these empires was the Songhai or Songhai Empire. The empires occupied the area of land along the river Niger in present-day West Africa. Songhai had several flourishing cities, the principal being Jenne. It was strongly fortified and was one of the great commercial centers of Islam. The leaders of the empire were vast in the development of commerce, exploration, education, and the Islamic faith. They often made lavish pilgrimages to Mecca. On one of these trips, it is believed that Askia the Great, who ruled the empire from about 1522 to 1538, had in his retinue 1,500 princes and chiefs of the empire, and a vast army of cavaliers and foot soldiers. He is reported to have given 300,000 pieces of gold to Mecca, Medina, and other holy cities.
Askia, the great Askia, became a legend in the history of the Songhai Empire because Askia himself followed the footsteps of Mansa Musa by going on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And he brought with him some of the landed scholars from the Muslim world to help not only in architectural design in terms of buildings, but also in terms of the cultivation of knowledge in the universities of Timbuktu, Sankore, and other places.
At home, along the mighty Niger River and its tributaries, Askia had harbors constructed and canals dug. A merchant fleet and war fleet were built to facilitate commerce and to protect it. To his ports came ships from Portugal and the Mediterranean, bringing goods in exchange for Songhai gold, copper, woods, and hides. To reassure foreign merchants, he ordered the standardization of weights and measures.
Askia Muhammad was very much concerned about Islamic law, some of the issues that are now being debated in Nigeria, such as the Sharia, because there is a book now which has been translated into English by John Hornwick at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, showing the correspondence between El-Maghili, this landed scholar in Islamic jurisprudence, and this African king, Askia Muhammad Toure, dealing with the whole question of governance and a number of other issues facing the contemporaries of Askia Muhammad Toure. Now, what we learn from this is the fact that in the Songhai Empire, not only did you have good governors who were very sensitive to the issues of governance among medieval Africans, but they were also very mindful about the intellectual currents raging in the Muslim world.
At present, researchers in Mali are gathering evidence of another emperor who ruled Mali in the 14th century, Abu Bakr II. It is believed that Abu Bakr discovered America nearly 200 years before Christopher Columbus. Abu Bakr II ruled what was arguably the richest and largest empire on earth, covering nearly all of West Africa. According to a Malian scholar, Kausu Jawara, he left with 2,000 boats. The emperor gave up all power and wealth to pursue knowledge and discovery. It is believed that in 1312, Abu Bakr II landed on the coast of Brazil, in the place known today as Recife. The researchers are also examining reports by Columbus himself, who said he found African traders present in the Americas when he arrived. These and other developments on the African continent over centuries of mankind's development have raised the question that if Africa occupied such a central place in the evolution of humanity, why is it that that which defines Africa today seems to be war, conflict, power struggles, disease, and even greed? As Thabo Mbeki puts it,
Our common history, and I say our common history, is one of slavery, of colonialism, of neocolonialism, of racism, which conditions have for many years impacted negatively on the development of the African continent. And in addition, the Cold War contributed to the exploitation and further underdevelopment of Africa.
The movement towards African independence is by no means complete. Imperialism and race thus remain very highly charged questions. Dr. Nkrumah once said to a journalist, and I quote, "In the last century, the European discovered Africa. In this century, Africans will discover Africa." He was talking, appropriately enough, at the conference of 8 independent African states in Accra in 1959, a movement that led to most of Africa's independence in the 1960s. To many observers, the fact that the colonial powers considered independence to these African states in the terrible state of fragmentation that they were in can only be seen as in pursuance of the old policy of divide and rule. The colonial powers granted a nominal type of political independence to individual small units so as to ensure the same old colonial type of economic organization continues long after independence. Throughout the ensuing years following independence, almost all attempts at federal union in Africa foundered. As a result, the images we see of Africa in the media today is of a continent at war with itself. There are stories about the collapse of civilian governments, life-threatening droughts, farming, natural disasters, military coups and the like. To all of which George Sono, in The New African, explains, 3 decades of dictatorship, phony and misunderstood ideology have left a legacy of fear, poverty, refugees, outright political thuggery and theft. Many leaders have held their citizens hostages, run their national economies like private chicken runs, and created a national mentality of siege and a state of helplessness. In view of Sono's explanation, the notorious Charles Taylor comes to mind. Breaking out of a Massachusetts prison in 1985, Charles Taylor gained military training in Libya as guest of Colonel Gaddafi. It was in Libya that he met Corporal Fode Sankor, who would go on to establish the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, and start the war in Sierra Leone in 1991. Mr. Taylor and Mr. Sankor helped each other over the next decade as soldiers loyal to each other. Both fought in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Liberia provided a conduit for diamonds smuggled out of Sierra Leone, as well as a source of arms. In addition to Sierra Leone's diamonds, Mr. Taylor has plundered his country's natural resources, enriching his family and a small circle. The people of Africa, however, do not seek political freedom for abstract purposes. They seek it because they believe that through political freedom they can obtain economic advancement, education, and real control over their own destiny. Towards this end, Thabo Mbeki said,
"The end of the 20th century should mark the end of that era. In the new century, Africans must surely make a new beginning. The commencement of the third millennium is witnessing, I believe, the emergence of a new generation of activists, of leaders, of people who have been stilled in the harsh realities of post-independence Africa. It is a generation nurtured in the post-colonial experiences of Africa and the Caribbean. It is a generation which has seen the end of the Cold War, which has been witness to and participants in Africa's greatest success, that is political liberation. But a generation that's also been witness to Africa's most tragic and disheartening failures. But I believe that this generation which has had this experience has a responsibility, perhaps a historic responsibility, to lead our continent and the African peoples into the 21st century. Whatever might be happening, I think there are signs of Africa's rebirth.
and it is true that Africa is undergoing a renaissance, much like the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s in the United States, where an unprecedented outburst of creative activities among Black America occurred in all fields of art. It has been said that the Harlem Renaissance was more than a literary movement and more than a social revolt against racism. The Harlem Renaissance is believed to have exalted the unique culture of African Americans and redefined the African American expression. Writers like James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the controversial autobiography of an ex-colored man in 1912, introduced many of the Harlem Renaissance's most talented poets in the Book of American Negro Poetry in 1922. Included in the anthology was Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born writer who became known for his use of dialect and militant verses, and later wrote Home to Harlem, 1928. Johnson's collection also introduced the famed poet and short story writer Langston Hughes, author of The Weary Blues of 1926 and many other volumes of poetry. Black women writers also found an audience through the Harlem Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston published an outstanding book of Southern folk tales, Mules and Men, in 1935, and the recently republished novel Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937.
Just as the African Americans redefined their expressions, the African Renaissance seems to be emerging from within those same realms of activities among Africans. Writers and activist leaders, the likes of Wole Soyinka, are bearing the torch towards democracy, human rights, and economic development in Africa. Born in Nigeria in 1934, Wole Soyinka is a playwright, poet, novelist, and a lecturer whose writings draw on African tradition and mythology. In 1986, Soyinka became the first African writer and the first black writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Soyinka often wrote about the need for individual freedom. Ironically, his views and activism in his native country for transparency in government landed him in prison. The Nigerian government jailed Soyinka and held him in solitary confinement from 1967 to 1969. In 1972, he wrote, "The Man Died, Prison Note from Wole Soyinka." Following the annulment of Nigeria's 1993 elections and the assumption of power by the military dictator Sani Abacha, Soyinka went into exile in 1994. Another writer and activist that has caught the eyes of the international community is Syl Cheney Coker. The Oxford Companion to 20th Century Poetry describes Cheney Coker's work as poems of causes. As a poet, novelist, and journalist, Cheney Coker delivered criticism of the powers that put his life at risk in Sierra Leone. One writer said of his writings, and I quote, "His verse conjures up an oppressed nation plagued with poverty and political tyranny, often with harsh African imagery." End quote.
After the first volume, which was quite an angry volume, I came to terms with the social realities of Africa. Africa, unlike the United States, offers a writer golden opportunities, to be politically and socially involved, because in a sense you are a participating voice. You're not writing on the margins of society. You become involved in the day-to-day struggles of Africa. You become involved in trying to be, as it were, a voice for the voiceless.
In one of his poems entitled "The Sun," the third verse reads, and I quote, "Running, I contemplate the time when growing up, I put behind me the image of the man who hobbles on a stick for his grain of rice to buckle his muscles against his fiery evening. The dog's eyes are running blood, they say in Sierra Leone. Why blame the sun?" End quotes.
Blazing the trail of the African Renaissance in the United Kingdom is Nigerian-born actress and pop star Patti Boulay. A controversial figure in the British political scene, Boulay caused a stir in London recently when she took a position in defense of London mayoral hopeful Lord Archer, a Tory, following a controversial comment he made on the weight and dress sense of black women. Boulay herself, a political hopeful as a Tory candidate for office in the London Assembly, has embarked on a crusade against the spread of disease in her native continent. She recently found Support for Africa 2000, a non-profit intervention NGO, to halt and reverse the trend of HIV/AIDS and malaria scourge on the continent. In other areas of development, all over the continent, Africans are embracing democracy, the challenge of human rights, and demanding transparency in government. Their leaders know that their countries are entering a new age, and they are determined to seize the opportunity to fit new ideas and new techniques to Africa, and Africa to new ideas and new techniques. May 29, 1999 marked an important milestone in Nigeria's political development. After 15 years of oppressive rule by the three military juntas, Nigeria renewed its march towards democracy. A civilian government was inaugurated. Since gaining independence from the British in 1960, Nigeria has made three major attempts at democratic civilian rule. The first experiment was fashioned after the British Westminster parliamentary system, but ended in a civil war between 1967 and 1970. At present, Nigeria has adopted the American presidential system, and it seems to be working fine. The country has been trying to restore public faith in government with an aggressive attack on corruption and efforts to manage the nation's wealth in a more responsible way. In other parts of the continent, a mixed record of democratization, including the emergence of a large number of hybrid regimes committed to effective governance and real economic development, but not Western-style democracy, has come alive. The focus is on the leaders who have come to power in Central Africa and the Horn: Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and the late Laurent Kabila of the former Zaire. Attention has focused on these five because upon taking power, all inherited economic basket cases and some the legacy of civil war. What sets this group apart is not their newness or cohesiveness as a bloc, but what they are against. All are committed to sweeping away the failures of the past, including the political class associated with those failures. All want to assert African control of the continent's destiny and thus reject a differential attitude toward outsiders and their advice.
In this effort, it is also fair to add that the movement for the renewal of Africa has from the beginning involved both the Africans living on the continent and those of the diaspora. To catch up, Africans need accumulated skills, the talent, and the capacity of the Africans of the diaspora. It is believed that the African American community in the United States constitutes the largest body of Africans living in the developed countries of the North. Politically speaking, if mobilized, the weight of this community could be a formidable factor in determining U.S. foreign policy towards Africa and in other areas in support of the African Renaissance. As Thabo Mbeki puts it,
one of the impediments towards the realization of our Renaissance is, of course, the question of racism. We will remember W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900, who said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. We said earlier this year, 2000, that the challenge of this century is resolving the question of the color line.
And so, as Africa forges forward into the 21st century, it is fair to say that there is a resolve among the people of our continent to tackle their own problems, to seek solutions to some of the seemingly intractable conflicts by addressing their root causes.
and so it is as we move forward with the African Renaissance.